Welcome to NucleCast, the official podcast of the ANWA Deterrence Center. Each week, we bring you leading experts for a lively discussion on topics related to strategic nuclear deterrence. Our host is Dr. Adam Lowther, Director of Strategic Programs at the National Strategic Research Institute. The views of the hosts and the guests are their own.
Welcome back to another episode of NucleCast. Of course, as every week, I am your host, Adam Lowther, and today we have with us Brigadier General retired Greg Bowen, who, as of today, is a senior fellow at the National Institute for Deterrent Studies and a consultant on many topics. And he started his Army career as an air defense officer and moved into missile defense, and then ultimately ended up retiring as the Deputy J3 at U.S. Strategic Command. Greg, thanks for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me back, Adam. Appreciate it.
So what we wanted to talk about today is a topic we haven't really talked about much on NIDS, and that is the role of air defenses and missile defenses in our current fight with Russia, or our potential fight with Russia, our proxy fight, let's call it that, with Russia, and then this preparation for the conflict that we believe is at least possible in the Asia Pacific with China, and for the Army and for air defenders in particular. There has been, as you'll talk about, a shift away from the role of air defense during the global war on terror. And then now that we're back in a peer environment in which we don't think we'll be able to maintain air superiority as we were in Afghanistan and Iraq, air defense is back as an important topic. So with that, could you sort of take us back in time to the Cold War and then bring us forward to the present?
Sure. I guess I have now officially become one of the old guys as a former Cold Warrior. But it's been kind of an interesting back to the future sort of vibe I've been getting as I read things and talk to people. So as a young air defense lieutenant, I was at my officer basic course at Fort Bliss, Texas, and they gave us our first classified threat briefing, and at that time it was the Soviets. It was all Soviets all the time. That was the enemy. It was a great time because you knew who your enemy was. So they brought us into this room and made a big deal of it. You had to sign into the roster and show your ID card, and it was all hush hush. And they proceeded to give us 2 hours of threat briefings on Soviet aircraft and missile systems and whatnot. And I walked out of there convinced that I was going to die in the Fulda Gap fighting the Ruskies. That's just how it was going to go down, because they had more tanks and more planes and more helicopters, and they were going to crush us. So that was kind of the environment that we trained in, and the Army maneuver units had to get used to fighting without air supremacy or air superiority, maybe air parity at best. And so we trained a lot with the maneuver guys and integrated air defense into the maneuver elements and basically tried to keep a bubble over them as they move forward. So that was kind of how things were done back then.
Now, when you were doing that, how relevant was the thought, which is, sort of a concern today, of Russian sort of short-range tactical nuclear weapons? Was that something you prepared for? And is that something you see us preparing for today?
Yeah, our assumption, well, there was a lot of miracles that had to occur for the fight in Europe to work out, not the least of which was we had to be able to flow forces into Germany and into Europe in order to blunt the Soviet armor coming across through the Fulda Gap. Our assumption was we would be able to do that and stop them. And then we thought they were probably going to use tactical nukes to cause a breakthrough. And so we trained constantly in MOP suits for chemical warfare and in a radiological environment. That we had all kinds of procedures that we had to practice constantly because we assumed we were going to be having to fight in that kind of an environment. So it's, again, and as you hear Putin's blustering and, what's going to happen in the Ukraine is you're going to pop a couple of nukes to gain an advantage. That all kind of comes back to me that's a difficult environment to fight in.
And do you see, is there any sort of effort underway today that would attempt to blunt those potential, for example, I and others have written about, potential attacks, if hypothetically Russia decided to move into the Baltic states and then NATO responded, that they might use nuclear weapons to blunt a NATO advance in the Sawaki Gap, something to that effect. Is the Army's air defense capability today prepared to try to blunt those type of attacks? I mean, we've watched in the videos from Ukraine where Ukrainians are shooting down cruise missiles that the Russians are launching. You can literally watch them, cruise missiles coming over, and then they're using weapons provided by the United States to shoot them down. Are we prepared for that kind of a attack today?
I would say we are getting prepared. So, and I've seen those videos, and that also warmed my heart being a former Stinger guy because those are Stingers. Yeah. And we sent a lot of Stingers to Afghanistan in the 80s when the Russians were in there, and that ruined their day. So the Russians don't like the Stinger missile, which is good. But when you look at the nuke threat, they could come in on cruise missiles, they could come in on ballistic missiles, they could be gravity weapons coming off of airplanes. So there is a variety of ways that they can deliver those weapons, and we can defend against some of that. But are you going to get all of them? Probably not.
Sure. So go ahead. I interrupted you.
I don't know. Anyway. It's kind of been Back to the Future for me. So fast forward a little bit. Cold War ends. We have relative quiet for a few years. The Army continues to kind of train and evolve the way they did. And then we get into GWAT. And for the next 20 years, the Army air defenders are fighting a GWAT war, which is completely different than what we were training for during the Cold War. Now, having said that, I don't want to discount the fact that our Patriot force in the Army, at least, the Army's the only one that has Patriot, but they got crushed with the deployment cycle. Everybody wanted Patriots, and they were there for TBM defense mostly. There wasn't a big air threat, in Iraq, and what there was, the Air Force took care of pretty handily, and there was no air threat in Afghanistan. So the Patriot crews they were just in constant rotations, and it was becoming a problem to sustain that for the Army. The only other kind of relevant air defense thing was IFPC, the indirect fire protection capability, which I also love because it's essentially a Vulcan cannon like I had when I was a lieutenant, except a little bit more high tech. But we got away from embedding air defense in the maneuver elements because we didn't need to. So the other air defense units that were running convoys and doing all kinds of different things that didn't have anything to do with air defense. So some of those skills atrophied, and then the old guys like me that remembered how we did it back in the day had, moved on and retired. And so now we've got an entire generation of leaders in the Army that have known nothing but GWAT, and they've always been able to operate in a benign air environment. So break. Now we're looking at the Russians in Europe, and then you've got the Chinese in the Indo-PACOM theater, and that will not be a benign air environment. If we can get air parity, that would be good. but having air superiority or air supremacy is probably a bridge too far, particularly in Indo-PACOM because of the distances involved. So now the Army is going to have to learn to fight in a denied environment again, and the air defenders are going to have to step up and move with the maneuver units again. So we've kind of come full circle in my head. The technology is a little different. We've got new command and control systems, but the basic blocking and tackling of what they're going to have to do is eerily similar to what we did in the 1980s.
So as we think about air defense in the Indo-Pacific, there's this sort of a concern that U.S. bases in Japan, Guam, Diego Garcia are vulnerable and will be some of the first targets struck in an effort to deny the United States the ability to push the Chinese back from Taiwan. And so this, of course, is a perfect opportunity for air defense to play an important and critical role. As you contemplate the capabilities of the Chinese and then our air defense capabilities that are online or coming online, do you think that we have sufficient capability, the right capability, to effectively defend those bases and those assets? And then even, the Chinese will be seeking to strike U.S. the American fleet, and can the Army from ground bases across the Pacific, provide that sort of overwatch that is required to defend the fleet? Do we have the kind of long range fires and all of that that's required, or are we highly vulnerable?
I wouldn't characterize us as highly vulnerable, but probably vulnerable. The Chinese have a lot of missiles and a lot of pretty sophisticated systems. I think the key to success in Indo-PACOM is going to be the integration of Army ground-based air defense, missile defense in that case primarily, and the Navy with their Aegis ships. But you kind of touched on the point I was going to make. With the Aegis ships, the Navy built those for fleet defense, and that's what they want to use them for. They don't want to park them off the coast of Guam and have them steaming around in circles for a month at a time, defending Guam or Diego, or you pick your island. So there's going to be a friction between the Navy wanting to do fleet defense, which they need to do because they're going to be targeted. But I don't think at least the current amount of inventory the Army has, I don't think the Army can do it alone. Now they're working through that. They're doing more buys. We are encouraging our allies to get some of these weapon systems, and we've got a number of them that want THAAD and Patriot, and we've been selling them those systems and SM-3s to some of the countries. So I think when you look at the allied picture in Indo-PACOM, China's kind of out there by themselves, and on the other side is the U.S. and all of our allies. And if you combine all that, I think you have a pretty decent chance. But look, no defense is going to be leak proof. You're going to get some leakers. You're going to take some damage. It's going to happen, and they will have to do a defense design. So they'll build, and they've already done this, I'm quite certain, their critical asset list, and from that will be their defended asset list, and then they will put their assets down to defend those critical things that absolutely, that we need to flow forces into the theater, and they'll try to do that. But you can't defend everywhere. We just don't have enough forces. And even when I was at Stratcom, one of the things that Stratcom did was integrated missile defense. So all the cross-combatant command missile defense. And every year, the combatant commands would do a request for forces, and everybody wanted Patriot and THAAD. They wanted more THAAD and Patriot than the Army has in their inventory. So what we had to do at Stratcom was make some informed decisions and recommendations to the department that, yeah, this COCOM, we agree they need 3 of these. These guys asked for 3, but they can only have 2 because we just don't have enough inventory out there. So it's always been a low density, high demand kind of capability, and that's going to continue for the foreseeable future, I think.
Now we're at that time of the show where we have to take a quick break, but when we come back, I want to ask you about, you mentioned this low density, high demand, and I'm curious as to why our capabilities are not meeting that demand. And so we're talking with Greg Bowen, and we'll be right back. This episode of Nuclecast is brought to you by the ANWA Deterrence Center, whose mission is to educate Americans about the nuclear enterprise and strategic deterrence. And we're back, and you're listening to Nuclecast. Of course, I'm your host, Adam Lowther, and we're talking with Brigadier General Retired Greg Bowen, and we're having a great discussion about air defense. Now, before the break, I asked you mentioned low density, high demand. And at this point, we have the technology pretty well in hand. We can make Patriots at a somewhat cost-effective price. Why do we not have more of it?
Very simple. It's budget priorities. The Army, and again, I'm going back to 20 years of GWAT. That was an expensive proposition. So the Army had to make some hard decisions on what are we going to spend money on for current ops, what are we going to spend money on for modernization, R&D, and there just wasn't enough money to go around. So while we still had the demand signals coming out of the combatant commands, I think the Army was willing to accept a certain amount of risk because they had other things that they needed to spend their money on. So it was a prioritization scheme. There's never enough money. The other kind of economic angle to this, you talk about Patriot or THAAD. Those are expensive missiles. Yeah, we've got production to the point where the cost is acceptable to the DoD. I don't want to buy a THAAD missile. I can't afford that on my retirement pay. But you quickly get into a situation where the enemy or the adversary can saturate you with a bunch of low cost ballistic missiles, and you get into a scenario where you're sending a $50 million missile interceptor up after a $1 million ballistic missile, right. And the economics kind of burn you pretty quickly that way. So there's other ways to get after the problem. There's what we used to call left of launch air defense. In other words, strike ops to take them out before they can launch. There's cyber things that you can do. There's electronic warfare things you can do. And you mix all these capabilities together. The kinetic is just one part of a broader integrated air and missile defense system.
Well, so this brings to mind an experience I had. So I was a sailor on the USS Ramage, which was Arleigh Burke DDG-61. And I'll never forget, we were doing operations. We're doing some training off the coast of Vieques Island down. That was where the Atlantic Fleet used to train. And we were testing our CWIS, our close-in weapon system, our CWIS mount. We had it on auto, and there was an aircraft, an Air Force jet that was towing a drone on, I don't know, 3,000 or 4,000 feet of cable. And, the CWIS was to acquire and then target the drone. And it did it beautifully. And then it saw the cable and started shooting up the cable at, and it was going to reach the aircraft. And so that was a bit of that was a pilot who whenever he got back to base had a wet flight suit. So I wonder, and this is just sort of off topic, but can CWIS mounts, or they're that was more than 20 years ago. Do we have something sort of that's that sort of low cost option that that can defend? Because we have these systems on across the Navy fleet, and it's it's a close in defense for the fleet. Do we have those that can defend bases? And I've not noticed on as I've been across the Air Force, for example, CWIS mounts out at airfields or anywhere else. Do we have capabilities that might not be as expensive as as a Patriot?
Yeah, absolutely. So earlier I mentioned IFPIC, and IFPIC is essentially a CWIS on a trailer.
Okay.
And again, kind of going back to my history, my first job as a lieutenant was a Vulcan platoon leader. It's the same gun, this a 20 millimeter Vulcan. And so I have many fond memories of listening to Vulcans firing and shooting them. And it was great fun until you had to police up the brass and links, because we had to do that with shovels. But yeah, so there's IFPIC is out there, and it's very effective, and it's capable of shooting down mortar rounds, and I mean it's awesome. You've got the Avenger system, which is a couple of pods of Stingers. It carries 8, 4 on each side. It's mounted on a Humvee. That's very inexpensive. Those are out there right now, and there's some other things that they're looking at. But the key is being able to characterize the battle space and having the right sensors in the right place. So your radars and your infrared sensors, you got to be able to see the targets coming. And so I think when they've been doing testing on IBCS, and the whole idea behind IBCS is any sensor, any shooter. It's right. They all plug in everything. The data all gets fused. And then the system says, you shoot at this and you shoot at this. And it helps there's human in the loop, obviously. But the way that we built these systems in the past, Adam, is they were stovepipes, or as we call them, cylinders of excellence, right? So a Patriot radar could only control a Patriot missile.
Right. A
THAAD radar could only do a THAAD missile, et cetera, et cetera. Now where we're getting to is any sensor, be it coming off the spy radar on a ship or a Patriot radar or whatever, can feed into this system, and it figures out the track, and it's helps the operator select the right weapon to engage it. So we try to preserve our ammunition, essentially.
Yeah. So as we think about the Indo-Pacific, and we think about this sort of air defense mission that's it's already here, but it's going to grow. And I often wonder, as I think about scenarios in which nuclear weapons might be used in the Indo-Pacific, I wonder if I could envision, for example, that a carrier strike group is moving towards Taiwan, let's say from the United States, from California. And as it gets into the East China Sea, the Chinese use a low yield theater nuclear weapon, ballistic missile, to potentially initially, and maybe it's a demonstration strike, to warn off the carrier strike group, to say essentially turn around and go home. You don't want this fight. Or to potentially, if that fails, maybe they strike the carrier strike group. Is that a scenario in which our air defenses, Patriot, THAAD, could actually defend the fleet against that? Or are those scenarios that we don't have then there's scenarios with the North Koreans. Can we effectively shoot down North Korean ballistic missiles if that's something we want to do.
Yeah. So there's kind of a couple of different aspects to that question. So let me try to attack the China problem first. If they do what essentially would be a demonstration, right? If they pop a nuke someplace just to warn us off, they're risking escalation. So would they do that, or would they just go all in and attack a carrier strike group, for example? That's a calculus that they're going to have to figure out internally. When looking at that from an air defense perspective, yes, the Army, if they're in the right places on the right islands with these systems, can certainly put a bubble over Navy ships. And similarly, the Aegis ship can put a bubble over an island that's got Army or Marines on it operating. So it's got to be a joint effort, no matter how you do it. I can't fathom any scenario where just single service is going to do their thing. It's going to be a joint and combined operation with our allies and all of our joint force. So I think when you get everything kludged together, there's a reasonable chance of having some success. But it's going to be tough because the Chinese have a lot of missiles. The other thing though that has been kind of bouncing around in the back of my head is I have to think that China has been watching how badly the Russian army has underperformed in the Ukraine, and maybe having second thoughts about going into Taiwan. Could the same thing happen to them? Could they get bogged down for a year plus and lose a whole pile of people and not get through their objective? So I think maybe the Ukraine thing is good from a Indo-PACOM perspective, because it may be giving the Chinese a moment to go, are our guys that good or not? So,
and an amphibious assault is certainly no easy task.
No. And of course, I think the last U.S. amphibious assault for real was Incheon,
yeah,
during Korea, I think. Yeah. So we aren't exactly up to date on that either from an experience perspective. And then kind of shifting to your North Korea question. Yeah, we've got quite a bit of capability against the North Koreans. GMD was specifically built to counter that threat. And I'm very confident if they decide to shoot some this direction towards Konus, we'll be able to take them out. That's I think, a foregone conclusion. But the theater stuff, if they start raining missiles down on Seoul, and honestly, Seoul is inside of artillery range for the North Koreans. Yeah. So that's the bigger problem set there. I don't know if we have enough forces in theater right now in South Korea between the U.S. systems and the South Korean systems to handle all of the stuff coming in. I just don't know, but they will have a defense plan, and they will have their critical asset list, and they'll be defending those things that they need to defend with what they've got.
And then now, as you think Taiwan, and if we can switch there, as we think about potential uses of nuclear weapons against Taiwan, what role do you think? Because I imagine that we will be equipping and selling the Taiwanese over the coming years all of the capability we think they might need to repel an invasion. Because part of the discussion is, that the Taiwan should become a porcupine, that can't be swallowed. And a significant portion of that would clearly be that they have to have air defense capabilities, because they can expect a ballistic missile barrages. They can expect perhaps airborne assault. All of these things would play a role. And this is sort of exactly what, the Army is prepared to fight. Or do you see the Army actively preparing the Taiwanese, and is that an effort that's going well?
Yeah, and again, I'm on the outside now looking in, but I do know we've had organizations in Taiwan for years training them very quietly. That's acknowledged, but my understanding is they have upped that game quite a bit. So there is a lot of training going on, and you're right. The porcupine concept is kind of where they're going. And as I look at it from China's point of view, I think there's a fairly low probability of them going nuclear, trying to take Taiwan, because one of the key things they want in Taiwan is all the industry. They want the chip plants. They want all the manufacturing They don't want to blow all that stuff up. That's the whole reason for going there, in addition to, saying you're ours. But I don't think they want to destroy the infrastructure. So my guess is they're trying to figure out a way they can get in quickly and quietly and take down the government and take control without firing too many shots.
Yeah, I mean,
is my guess.
You bring up a great point that this could be what we're preparing for. Might be the exact wrong approach that we think that the Chinese are going to take. That it could be sort of an internal effort that would be more along the lines of a coup, a spy movie, something to that effect, as opposed to a large scale amphibious assault. So as we run out, as with every show, we always run out of time in the midst of a conversation. So for our listeners who probably don't think about missile defenses and air defenses that frequently, what is the big takeaway for them as they think about, particularly for our audience that mostly is, a nuclear focused audience? What do they need to know and sort of keep in the back of their minds as we end the show?
Integrated air and missile defense is back in style as we look at fighting a couple of near-peer competitors potentially at the same time that have fifth-generation fighter aircraft that have a lot of missiles, sophisticated stealth capabilities, cruise missiles, you name it. We're not fighting cavemen in this scenario. So the integrated air and missile defense is going to be absolutely critical to success. It's something that has been, I won't say ignored, but it's been kind of on the back burner for the last 20 years because we didn't have a need. Now we have a need again, and we've got a little bit of catching up to do. So it will be critical to our success if we do end up in a conflict.
All right. Brigadier General Retired Greg Bowen, thanks for joining us on Nuclecast.
Thanks, Adam. Appreciate it.
And thanks to you, the listeners, and we'll see you on the next episode. Well, so Adam's afterthoughts. That was another interesting episode where we were able to discuss it's something that we just don't think about that often, air defense. And I think Greg really pointed this out, that it sort of went away as a concern during the GWAT, if I can use that term anymore. And now it's back and probably more important than ever. And for me, I spent a few years with the Army as a professor at SAMS and then standing up the MDO department at the Combined Arms Center. And I sort of, in my understanding of the Army, came to think that air defense was going to become sort of a critical, if not the critical mission of the Army, because that would be where it could play a most relevant role in the Pacific. So this was a good talk. I'm glad we talked about air defense and missile defense, because I think it's something we can often forget.
This has been a production of the ANWA Deterrence Center. Our executive producer is Kimberly Charrington, and this episode has been engineered and mixed by David Prunthal. Follow the show on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at Nuclecast. Listen, follow, and review the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.